On the afternoon of December 20th, 1976, a 74-year-old man collapsed on the near north side of Chicago, half a block from a restaurant where he was headed for lunch. He was carried into his private physician's office at 900 North Michigan Avenue. Within the hour, he was pronounced dead of a massive heart attack. And within 2 hours, something unprecedented happened in the third largest city in America. The government stopped, not literally. The traffic lights still worked. The water still ran. But the mechanism that actually governed Chicago, the invisible web of phone calls, nods, favors, and instructions that determined who got hired, who got promoted, who got contracts, who got elected, that mechanism had no backup system. It had a single point of failure. One man. And now that man was gone. His name was Richard J. Daley. He had been mayor of Chicago for 21 years and chairman of the Cook County Democratic Party for 23. Some political observers at the time called him the second most powerful politician in America, behind only the president. Others argued that comparison was generous to the president, because presidents are constrained by Congress, by courts, by term limits. Daley was constrained by nothing. To understand how a single individual could accumulate that kind of authority inside a democratic system, legally, openly, and with the enthusiastic support of a majority of voters, you have to understand the specific world that produced him. Chicago, at the turn of the 20th century, was a city of factions: Irish, Polish, Italian, German, Czech, Lithuanian. Each immigrant group staked out territory on the south side or the west side, each with its own churches, its own social halls, its own economic networks. Governing this patchwork required something more flexible than ideology. It required a transaction. You needed your garbage collected, your street plowed, your cousin hired at the water department. The local Democratic ward organization could arrange all of that. In return, you showed up on election day and voted the straight ticket. The deal was never written down. It didn't need to be. This was the machine. And it wasn't unique to Chicago. Tammany Hall in New York ran a similar operation, as did the Pendergast operation in Kansas City. But what made Chicago different was that the machine survived longer and operated more efficiently than any of its counterparts. By the middle of the 20th century, when most other city machines were rotting from the inside, Chicago's was about to enter its golden age. Richard Joseph Daley was born on May 15, 1902, in the Bridgeport neighborhood, a tight Irish Catholic enclave on the south side, wedged between the Union Stockyards and the Illinois and Michigan Canal. His father was a sheet metal worker who said little. His mother was a suffragette who said plenty, and she had specific plans for her only child. When Richard eventually won the Democratic nomination for Cook County Sheriff, Lillian Daley told a friend she was disappointed. "I didn't raise my son to be a policeman." She needn't have worried. Her son had no interest in being a policeman, or a lawyer, though he earned a law degree from DePaul in night school, or a legislator, though he would serve in both chambers of the Illinois General Assembly. Richard Daley's only true interest, from the age of 21 until the day he died, was the accumulation and exercise of organizational power. His first laboratory was the Hamburg Athletic Club, a Bridgeport institution that straddled the line between civic group and street gang. Daley became president at 22. He did not distinguish himself as a fighter or an athlete. He distinguished himself as a bookkeeper, the man who tracked the dues, organized the schedule, maintained the rolls. It was unglamorous work. It was also a perfect apprenticeship for what came next, because the structure of the Hamburg Club mirrored the structure of the ward organization, which mirrored the structure of the county party, which mirrored the structure of the machine itself. Hierarchies within hierarchies, obligations flowing upward, favors flowing down. The man who understood the ledger understood everything. Daley spent the next 2 decades moving through a series of positions that most ambitious politicians would have considered stepping stones to something more visible. He never treated them that way. He treated each one as a chance to learn a different part of the machine's anatomy. As secretary to the county treasurer, he learned where the money went. As chief deputy comptroller of Cook County, he learned how it was allocated. In the Illinois Senate, where he served as minority leader, he learned how legislation was drafted, traded, buried, and resurrected. As Cook County clerk, he learned the mechanics of elections, not the campaigning part, but the counting part. By 1953, when he became chairman of the Cook County Democratic Central Committee, Daley had spent 30 years studying a system from the inside. He understood it the way a mechanic understands an engine, not abstractly, but with his hands. What happened next redefined American municipal politics. In 1955, Daley ran for mayor and won, and then he did something no Chicago boss had ever attempted. He kept both jobs, chairman and mayor. The man who controlled the party apparatus and the man who controlled City Hall. Previous bosses had always separated those roles, installing a puppet in one seat while they occupied the other. Daley refused. He held both simultaneously for the remaining 21 years of his life. The consequences were immediate and structural. Chicago technically operated under a weak mayor system, with the 50-member city council holding primary legislative authority. Under Daley, this distinction became theoretical. The aldermen who sat on that council owed their nominations to the party organization. The party organization was controlled by ward committeemen. The ward committeemen answered to the chairman. The chairman was the mayor. Any alderman who defied Daley wasn't simply disagreeing with a colleague. He was threatening the entire patronage chain that kept his ward functioning. The park district jobs, the streets and sanitation positions, the building inspectors and precinct captains who formed the invisible government of every neighborhood in the city. Daley's power came from his control over approximately 1 million votes, channeled through a system of roughly 3,500 precinct captains. Each captain was personally responsible for cultivating relationships with 400 to 500 voters. These were not anonymous constituents. They were neighbors whose names the captain knew, whose problems the captain tracked, whose loyalty on election day the captain could predict with startling accuracy. A good precinct captain didn't just get out the vote. He owned the vote, and every precinct captain in the city reported through layers of ward committeemen and zone leaders to one desk. Daley personally selected every Democratic candidate who ran for office in Cook County. Judges, state legislators, county commissioners, congressmen. If your name appeared on the Democratic ticket in Chicago, it was because Daley had approved it. If he hadn't, your name didn't appear. The primary was the real election. The general was a formality. Winning a Democratic primary in Chicago without machine support was like swimming upstream in concrete. And here is the part that confounded Daley's critics and fascinated his students. He used this extraordinary concentration of power to govern with a competence that was almost offensive in its effectiveness. Detroit was bleeding jobs, while Cleveland was defaulting on its debt, while Buffalo and St. Louis were watching their tax bases evaporate as white residents fled to the suburbs, while the entire industrial Midwest was collapsing into what would later be called the Rust Belt, Chicago held. The streets were plowed. The garbage was picked up. The buses ran on something close to a schedule. Services were delivered with a reliability that other American cities couldn't match, and the reason was brutally simple. The patronage system created tens of thousands of city and county employees whose continued employment depended on doing their jobs well enough that voters would keep the machine in power. The physical transformation was staggering. O'Hare International Airport, expanded under Daley's direct supervision, became one of the busiest in the world. McCormick Place, the convention center, rose on the lakefront. The expressway system, the Dan Ryan, the Kennedy, the Eisenhower, the Stevenson, was carved through the city during the Daley years, connecting neighborhoods to jobs, suburbs to downtown, and Chicago to the interstate highway network that was reshaping American commerce. the skyline exploded upward. Marina City, the John Hancock Center, and the crown jewel, the Sears Tower, completed in 1973. At that moment, the tallest building on Earth. The city's nickname during this period was not aspirational. It was descriptive. People called Chicago the city that works. Nationally, Daley operated at a level that few municipal politicians have ever reached. In 1959 and 1960, he served as president of the United States Conference of Mayors. His endorsement was sought by every Democratic presidential contender. His opposition was feared by all of them. Control over the Illinois delegation at the Democratic National Convention gave him outsized influence over the party's direction, and he wielded it without apology. The most consequential exercise of that influence came on a single night in November 1960. John F. Kennedy won Illinois by approximately 8,000 votes, a margin so thin that the slightest variation in any direction would have flipped the state. The votes that produced Kennedy's victory came overwhelmingly from Cook County, and specifically from precincts controlled by Daley's organization. Republican allegations of fraud surfaced immediately. Precincts were identified where the number of votes cast exceeded the number of registered voters. Tallies had been reported with suspicious delays. Whether Daley actually manufactured enough ballots to change the outcome of the presidential election remains one of the most debated questions in American political history. Some historians say the evidence is circumstantial. Others say the numbers are damning. What no one disputes is that Daley possessed the infrastructure to do it, that both parties knew he possessed it, and that this knowledge itself constituted a form of power that transcended what any single city official is supposed to hold. After Kennedy's victory, federal money poured into Chicago at an extraordinary rate. Daley had a direct relationship with the White House. Construction accelerated. The machine hummed. But there was a cost to all of this, and it was paid by people who had no seat at the table when the ledger was drawn, because the same man who built the skyline also built walls. Not the visible kind, the kind made of zoning codes, highway routes, and 16-story concrete towers placed with surgical precision along racial boundaries that had been informally observed for decades. Chicago in the 1950s was among the most racially segregated cities in the United States. Daley did not create that segregation, but he institutionalized it in steel and concrete with a deliberateness that went beyond anything his predecessors had attempted. The public housing projects he authorized, the Robert Taylor homes, Stateway Gardens, the expansion of Cabrini Green, were built almost exclusively within existing black neighborhoods. The Robert Taylor homes alone stretched for 2 miles along State Street, 28 identical 16-story towers containing 4,415 apartments, forming the densest concentration of public housing in the nation. These buildings were marketed as modern replacements for decaying tenements. In practice, they became vertical containers, overcrowded, underfunded, and isolated from the economic life of the city by design. The Dan Ryan Expressway served as the physical barrier. 14 lanes wide at certain points, it was deliberately routed along the traditional racial dividing line on the south side, creating a concrete canyon between black neighborhoods to the east and white neighborhoods to the west. The routing was not an engineering necessity. Alternative paths existed. Daley chose this one. The highway did not just carry traffic. It carried a message written in the language of infrastructure. This side is yours, that side is ours, and the wall between them will outlast any conversation about fairness. For years, this system produced political stability. Black voters in Chicago supported Daley at rates exceeding 70% in municipal elections through the mid-1960s. The machine offered them the same transactional bargain it offered everyone: loyalty in exchange for jobs and services. What it did not offer was access, not to integrated neighborhoods, not to equitable schools, not to the economic transformation reshaping the downtown skyline. In 1966, the contradictions arrived in the form of Martin Luther King Jr. King's Chicago campaign was unlike anything he had attempted in the South. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference partnered with local activists in the Chicago Freedom Movement, a direct challenge to housing segregation in a northern city that prided itself on being more progressive than Birmingham or Selma. King rented an apartment in a West Side tenement to illustrate the squalor Black Chicagoans were forced to endure. He led marches through all-white neighborhoods on the Southwest Side demanding open housing. The response from white residents was savage. Rocks, bottles, Confederate flags waved in a city north of the Mason-Dixon line. Racial epithets screamed at a Nobel laureate. Daley absorbed all of it without panic and without concession. He was too tactically sophisticated to confront King with the brutality that had backfired so spectacularly against Southern segregationists. Instead, he deployed a different arsenal: negotiation, delay, co-optation. He brought black political leaders loyal to the machine into mediation sessions. He used the Chicago media to frame the marches as disruptive provocations rather than moral imperatives. And in August 1966, he brokered the Summit Agreement, a document that promised vague improvements in housing practices while committing to nothing enforceable. King left Chicago, calling it one of the most discouraging campaigns of his career. Most historians assess the freedom movement as a failure, or at best a stalemate. Daley had done what he had always done: identified the pressure point, managed the optics, and preserved the existing order without yielding an inch of structural ground. 2 years later, the order itself cracked open. April 4th, 1968. King was assassinated in Memphis. Riots swept through Chicago's West Side. Entire blocks burned. Daley, incensed by what he perceived as police restraint in the face of destruction, made a statement that would follow him permanently. He told reporters he had ordered the police superintendent to shoot to kill any arsonist and shoot to maim or cripple anyone looting. Jesse Jackson called it fascism. Daley retreated from the language within days, eventually claiming the order had never been issued. The damage was done regardless. The words became the headline, and the headline became the narrative. Then came August. The Democratic National Convention, hosted in Chicago, was supposed to demonstrate Daley's mastery, his ability to deliver a world-class event in a city that ran like a Swiss clock. It demonstrated something else entirely. Outside the International Amphitheater, anti-war protesters and Chicago police officers collided in what an independent federal investigation would later describe in official language as a police riot. Demonstrators were beaten with batons on Michigan Avenue. Tear gas drifted through Grant Park. The images were broadcast live on national television, intercut with scenes from the convention floor, where the Democratic Party was consuming itself over Vietnam, over civil rights, over the meaning of the country. Inside the hall, when Connecticut Senator Abraham Ribicoff compared the scene outside to Gestapo tactics, television cameras caught Daley on the convention floor, face contorted, shouting something that lip readers later decoded in language too profane for broadcast. Daley denied it. Witnesses confirmed it. The specifics hardly mattered. The image was indelible. The boss, red-faced, screaming from the floor of a convention that was collapsing around him. It was a catastrophe for the Democratic Party. Hubert Humphrey won the nomination and lost to Richard Nixon in November. For Daley personally, it created a public identity he would spend the rest of his life trying to dislodge. And yet, Chicago elected him again, twice more, a fifth term in 1971, a sixth in 1975. National opinion polls conducted after the convention showed that a majority of Americans actually approved of how Daley handled the protesters. His support in Chicago remained formidable. Whatever the editorial pages thought, the machine still produced the votes. The architecture was weakening in ways the public could not yet see. In 1969, a young independent candidate named Michael Shackman filed a federal lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of Chicago's patronage system. The case argued that conditioning government employment on political loyalty violated the First Amendment. In 1972, a consent decree was issued, the Shockman Decree, barring the city and Cook County from firing employees based on their political activity. A subsequent ruling in 1979 extended the ban to patronage hiring itself. The legal scaffolding that held the machine together was being dismantled, beam by beam, in a federal courtroom. Simultaneously, corruption investigations closed in on Daley's inner circle. His press secretary was convicted of mail fraud. His former administrative assistant was indicted. Aldermen allied with the organization were charged with bribery, extortion, and tax evasion. One by one, the men who had implemented Daley's system were held to account for the way that system operated. Daley himself was never charged, never indicted, never formally accused of any crime. Whether this reflected personal integrity or effective insulation remains one of the permanent arguments of Chicago political history. Mike Royko, the legendary Chicago Daily News columnist, published his biography of Daley in 1971 under a single-word title, Boss. The portrait was clinical and unsparing. Royko documented the precinct-level mechanics of the machine with the precision of a forensic accountant. The favor ledgers, the vote predictions, the understanding that a job at the Water Reclamation District came with an obligation that extended far beyond the workday. Royko captured a quote from a fellow state senator who had known Daley in Springfield. "You couldn't give that guy a nickel, that's how honest he is." It was meant as praise. In context, it read as something stranger. The portrait of a man who had built a system saturated in corruption while remaining personally untouched by it, as if the architect of a flood could somehow stay dry. Daley lived his entire life within blocks of where he was born. The bungalow at 3536 South Low Avenue, where he raised 7 children, sat a short walk from Nativity of Our Lord, the parish church he attended from childhood until the morning of his death. He walked the same sidewalks at 74 that he had walked at 10. He ate at the same restaurants. He worshipped in the same pew. There was something almost monastic about it. A man who controlled billions of dollars in public construction, who picked judges and congressmen, who influenced the selection of presidents, living in a brick bungalow in a working-class neighborhood as if nothing had changed since 1902. When he died, his estate was worth less than $50,000. The succession crisis that followed was immediate and ugly. Aldermen who had spent decades deferring to a single authority discovered they had no procedure for resolving conflict without him. The party organization fractured along ethnic and geographic lines that Daley had spent 20 years suppressing. Michael Bilandic was installed as acting mayor through a backroom deal. He was replaced by Jane Byrne in a 1979 upset that shocked the organization. And in 1983, Harold Washington, running explicitly against the machine, explicitly against the legacy of Daley, became the first black mayor in Chicago's history, winning with 52% of the vote. The Robert Taylor homes that Daley had built began their slow descent into crisis almost as soon as they opened. Chronic underfunding, gang violence, and the concentration of poverty within isolated towers produced conditions that became a national symbol of failed public housing. The demolition began in the early 2000s. By 2007, every one of the 28 buildings was gone. In their place came mixed-income developments built at human scale, low-rise, scattered site designed on principles that represented the complete repudiation of everything Daley's housing policy had stood for. And yet his son became mayor. Richard M. Daley took office in 1989 and held it for 22 years, surpassing his father's record. Another son, William, became Secretary of Commerce under Clinton and White House Chief of Staff under Obama. A grandson served on the Cook County Board. The name remained embedded in the city's political genome decades after the machine that created it had been legally dismantled and officially declared extinct. The Daley paradox is not a simple one to resolve, and perhaps it shouldn't be. He preserved Chicago when comparable cities disintegrated. The infrastructure he built still functions. The airport still operates at global scale. The expressways still carry millions of commuters. The convention center that bears his name still generates billions in economic activity. He kept a city of 3 million people employed, housed, and functional during an era when American urbanism was in free fall. He also engineered the most thorough system of racial segregation in any northern city, cemented it in concrete and asphalt, and then outmaneuvered the most important civil rights leader of the 20th century when that leader came to challenge it. He built public housing designed not to shelter people but to contain them. He routed highways not to move traffic but to enforce boundaries. He created a patronage system so comprehensive that it took 45 years of federal litigation to dismantle it. He may or may not have tipped a presidential election, and the fact that the question remains open tells you everything about the scope of his reach. He once gave a press conference defending the police during the convention crisis and misspoke in a way that became legendary. He meant to say that the policeman exists to preserve order. What he actually said was, "The policeman is not here to create disorder. The policeman is here to preserve disorder." Everyone laughed. Everyone understood it was a verbal stumble. But there are people in Chicago, people who grew up on the South Side, who watched the towers go up and the neighborhoods get walled off, who will tell you that sentence was the most accurate description of Daley's Chicago that anyone ever produced. The system was not designed to eliminate disorder. It was designed to manage it, to contain it, to decide which neighborhoods experienced it and which were protected from it. Order for some, disorder for others, preserved indefinitely. He died on a sidewalk in December, still in office, still chairman, still the man whose phone call could move a highway or end a career. His funeral at Nativity of Our Lord drew the President-elect of the United States and the sitting Vice President. The Monsignor who presided had known him since childhood. There is a plaza downtown that carries his name. A bronze statue overlooks it. Tourists walk past without knowing who he was. The people who do know tend to fall into two categories that have never agreed with each other and probably never will. One group remembers the skyline. The other remembers the wall. And Chicago, half a century later, still lives inside both.